All right, great. So we'll begin with today's review session. So today our mock paper review is brought to you by Overmark. So this is just a brief introduction to who we are. We are a team of tutors who strive to build a student-centric platform that can empower students with personal development and academic excellence knowledge, right? So we've all been through the education system ourselves. So we understand your struggles and we're here to help you by providing resources that can help you do well during your O-levels. Right, so let's take a look at the paper together. So just a brief introduction to what we'll be doing today. So today we'll be going through the history and social studies paper that I've set. And what I would like to go through today is not so much the essay questions, to which the answers will be given later, but more of the necessary social humanities skills needed for your source-based questions. Because most students, I find, are struggling with interpreting the sources accurately and understanding the question demand, which is why I would like to begin or focus more on the skills needed for humanities. All right, so let's go through the paper right now. Okay, so the first question is study source A. Why do you think this cartoon was published at this time? Explain your answer. So this is a very simple inference kind of question. Sorry, this was a very simple inference to purpose kind of question, in that the question is asking you to infer the purpose of the source. So why was it published at the time? So let's look at the source here. So over here, we can clearly see that this was a Soviet poster published in 1931. It is important to read the context here for these kind of sources, right? So at the onstart, it tells you something important here. It was published in 1931. And it says here, victory of the 5-year plan, a blow to capitalism. So right here, the first impression that you can get is that the 5-year plans have been successful. Then the next question you have to ask yourself is, why do you think the source was published at this time? Okay, so the answer here would read, this poster was published to convince the Soviet people of the successes of communism, thereby reinforcing their faith in the Communist Party. So how did I come to this statement at the start, the first point here? It is because it was published in 1931 and it was a Soviet poster. But the important thing to note here is, who is the intended audience? The intended audience, as you can see from the source, it was published in Russian, right? So it will mean that the intended audience is the intended audience is the Soviet people themselves. So it is important for you to establish who the message is for, when the message was published, and from that you can infer the purpose of the message itself. Right. So the answer will read, the poster was published to convince the Soviet people of the successes of communism, thereby reinforcing their faith in the Communist Party. So over here, you have a clear purpose and then an outcome. And this will lead to a very nice message which tells you about the purpose of the source. So you just have to quote the evidence. Source A reads, victory of the 5-year plan, a blow to capitalism. Then you go on to explain, this message is further reinforced by the image of a capitalist being crushed by the weight of the 5-year plan. This tells me that the 5-year plan was a massive success, far beyond the expectations of the capitalists. In fact, the communist plans were so successful that they literally crushed the capitalist expectations of it. The fact that the poster was published by the Soviets tells me that they wanted to tell their people of the successes of their 5-year plan and reinvigorate the people's belief in the success of the Communist Party. This would affirm the Soviet people's loyalty to communism due to the party's ability to improve the lives of the Soviet people through their well-thought-out 5-year plans. Thus, the purpose of the poster is to convince the people of the successes of communism and reaffirm their faith in the Communist Party. So I won't go too much into that about this because this is a relatively straightforward kind of question. Basically, you have to investigate the purpose of the source. And how do you do that? You must first understand what the source is trying to say, i.e. the message of the source. And then you have to look at the intended audience. Who is the intended audience? Now you know the message of now that you know the message of the source, who the intended audience of the source is, you then have to determine what is the outcome of this, what is the source trying to achieve. Basically, what is the specific outcome that the source wants to achieve, right? So these kinds of questions are rather basic. All you have to do is to establish these three elements and then go on to explain specifically how the image here leads to your inference and thus your purpose, right? Moving on to the next question. How far does source C agree with source D about the success of Stalin's 5-year plan? Explain your answer. So this is quite a straightforward comparative kind of question. It basically requires you to state the similarities and differences. So for a similarity and difference kind of question, to understand the question demand, you first have to look at the phrasing of the question. Some questions will simply require you to state the differences, while some questions will only require you to explain the similarities. In this case, the question here reads, how far does source C agree with source D? So this tells me, right, that there is some sort of evaluative component. You have to compare whether it is more similar or it is more different. So this tells you from the onstart that you need to identify one similarity and one difference between source C and D. So let's look at the source itself. So source C regarding the 5-year plan is a speech made by an English businessman in 1931 after he had visited Russia. So from the start, right, you can tell there is something interesting here. It is from the perspective of a capitalist who had visited Russia after the successes of the 5-year plan in 1931. So the speech goes, I am a capitalist, not a communist. Yet Russia is forging ahead, while because of the World Depression, our own factories and shipyards are closed and our people desperately seek work. Jokes have been made about the 5-year plan and its failure has been predicted. However, much more has been accomplished than ever expected. New cities are growing up, modern houses, schools, hospitals, workers' clubs, and nurseries, where the children of working mothers are cared for. Don't underestimate the Russians or their plans. Russia is a country of amazing activity. Most important, the workers in Russia have something which is sadly lacking in the capitalist countries today, and that is hope. And then we look at source D. It is basically an American cartoon which was also published in 1931. So here it quite clearly shows that Stalin is trying to clearly draw out his 5-year plan, but then his 5-year plan was foiled by the Great Depression, which is marked by the ink which has been spilled all over his plans, ruining his carefully planned 5-year plan. So at the start, we have to look at the similarities, right? To first determine the similarities, we have to see what is the sources, what is the main issue that the sources are dealing with. Over here, both sources are clearly dealing with the 5-year plan, right? So what is important here about the Western expectations of the 5-year plan? Because as we can see, right, both of these are Western capitalist perspectives of Stalin and the Soviet Union. So essentially, both the sources are similar in highlighting how the West had expected Stalin's 5-year plan to fail. Source C states, jokes have been made about the 5-year plan and its failure has been predicted. This tells me that the English businessman had initially made fun of Stalin's 5-year plan and had expected it to fail miserably. Similarly, source D shows the World Depression ruining Stalin's plan by messing up his supposedly elaborately planned 5-year plan. This tells me that the Americans had expected the Great Depression to mess up Stalin's centrally planned economy by introducing a global economic disaster. So evidently, both sources are very similar in highlighting how the West had expected Stalin's 5-year plan to fail miserably. So a lot of students face the difficulty in identifying the correct points to say. So in this case, right, how did I manage to find this particular point of similarity? First, I looked at the context of the source. When you see the context of the source, you'll notice that both of them are from Western sources, right? That gives you your first hint about the particular topic. So now you have two hints, right? You have the fact that it is from a Western source and the fact that it is specifically talking about the 5-year plan. That is how you will begin to narrow in into your source and try to figure out what exactly are they similar in. And it is important when you are establishing your first point here, when you're talking about the similarities, is to be very specific about how exactly they're similar. So it's not good enough to say that sources C and D have a similar perspective from the West of Stalin's 5-year plan. You must specifically say that the West had expected Stalin's 5-year plan to fail. You see the difference here? The difference is that in the first sentence, I'm only talking generally about the West and how they perceive the 5-year plan. In the second sentence, or this particular topic statement here, I'm being very specific and intentional with my use of language to bring out the point that the West had expected Stalin's 5-year plan to fail. So these are the kind of specificities you will need when you're writing in order to make it very clear to the marker that you know what you're talking about. Okay, moving on to the difference. I think the difference is quite obvious here. So both sources are both sources are different in demonstrating the actual outcome of Stalin's 5-year plan. While source D supposedly affirms that the Soviets' 5-year plan had failed, source C concedes that Stalin's 5-year plan had been wildly successful. Source C writes, however, much more has been accomplished than was ever expected. New cities are growing up, modern houses, schools, hospitals, so on and so forth. And then I'll move on to elaboration. This tells me that Stalin's 5-year plan was actually extremely successful because it helped to modernize Russia both economically and socially. On the other hand, source D portrays Stalin's 5-year plan as having failed miserably due to the World Depression. Despite source D being from 1931, it portrays a very different outcome from that of source C, telling me that the Soviet 5-year plan had failed miserably. Thus, both sources differ in portraying the actual outcome of the successes of Stalin's 5-year plan. So you notice as I'm writing, right, I introduce a lot of comparative elements. So look at this particular marker here. On one hand, source C states so on and so forth. On the other hand, source D states something else. And then I bring in more markers of comparative elements here. Despite source C saying so on and so forth, source D tells me something else. So this is very important for your writing because it provides more clarity. It tells the marker that you clearly know what is different, and then you can have the base to expound upon to tell the marker specifically what is it that is different. Okay, the next point is something that most students don't do, and is not entirely necessary, but it is a very beneficial thing for you to do if you want to achieve the highest band possible. So to achieve the highest band possible for source-based case study, you have to take into account the context of the source. And if you look at the question is kind of evaluative in nature, right? It's asking you, how far does it agree? So you have to state the extent to which you agree or disagree with the information on whether they are similar or more different. So in this case, you should evaluate the reason for the difference, which can tell you or inform you as to whether it is more accurate to say that the sources are more similar than different. So over here, when you take into account the context, the reasoning should go. The reason for the difference can be attributed to the provenance of source D. Source D is a poster which is targeted at the American public, whereas source C is a recount from an English businessman and his honest assessment of the modernization in Russia. It is expected that the American cartoon would want to portray the impact of the 5-year plan in this light because it would intentionally want to persuade the American public that capitalism was more effective than communism. Thus, it is expected that the sources would differ in their portrayal of the successes of the Soviet 5-year plan, given that source D has a vested interest in ensuring it's portrayed in a negative light. Right? So over here, you bring in some elements of purpose to explain the differences between the sources. So this is something that will help you attain the additional 1 or 2 marks, but it is less critical than hitting the nail on the head for the similarity and difference points. Okay? Okay, so someone asked, is there a need to write a purpose paragraph for these 2 sources? I would say that there is no strong need to do so, but for the sake of this exercise, for the sake of this practice, so that all of you are able to understand more deeply the provenance of the sources, I wrote this out because I think that it is important for you to understand why there's a difference in the first place. So this paragraph can help you bump your 5 out of 6 to a 6 out of 6. Okay, but it is not absolutely critical. Someone also asked, can I write Russia instead of USSR? Yes, you can write Russia instead of USSR because specifically in this source here, it already stated that he was visiting Russia. Okay. So move on to the third question. Study source B. Is source B reliable in its claim about the success of Stalin's 5-year plan? Explain your answer. So from the start, right, you already know that this is a very specific type of question. The question is asking you about the reliability of the source. In general, there are only a few ways to approach the reliability of source. First, you explain the context of the source or the provenance of the source to show why its claim is or is not reliable. The next way you can go about doing it is to corroborate with other sources or basically cross-refer to confirm the reliability. So these are the two most straightforward ways to evaluate the reliability of a single source. So let's look at the source in question. Source in question here is source B. So when we're doing a source-based exercise, I want all of you to note that it is very important for you to look at this particular statement here, right? So a lot of the times, right, students often spend more time trying to understand the source and looking at the information rather than the preamble here. But the preamble is actually very critical because it informs you the most about the context of the source, which is what will get you from your L3 to your L4 answer. So the preamble writes, a Soviet poster about the first 5-year plan from 1928. It shows the reaction of a capitalist, first to the plan, then to the effects of the plan. The words at the top of the poster say, the first 5-year plan, 1928. Below this, the capitalist is saying, fantasy, delirium, utopia. So the first and easiest reason to establish why this source is reliable is because of the corroboration here, right? So when you look at the source itself, it is quite hard to say that the source is reliable based on provenance, right? Because if you look at it, it is a Soviet poster. So the fact that it is a Soviet poster might hint towards some element of a lack of reliability because obviously they will have a vested interest in wanting to position themselves as being wildly successful in their own claims. So in such a case, right, the best way to ensure that it is reliable is by cross-reference. And you have to cross-reference it to a non-Soviet source. Why? So you can bring in the provenance explanation later of another source to show that this particular set of information from another source, which corroborates that of source B, is valid and useful as a proxy to indicate the reliability of source B. So over here, right, it's just basically stating what this claim, what the claim that source B is making. And here is the main bulk of the answer. So basically, since I cannot use provenance, I use the indicator of cross-reference. So source B's claim is reliable because it is corroborated by a similar claim made in source C. Source C is derived from the anecdotes of an English businessman who had visited Russia in 1931. The English businessman states that despite people having expected the failure of the 5-year plan, new cities are growing up, so on and so forth. This corroborates with the claim made in source B that the 5-year plan had far exceeded the expectations of the West and had succeeded where everyone else thought it would fail. The fact that the anecdote comes from an English businessman further contributes to the reliability of source B's claim, as it indeed affirms the cartoon's image of a capitalist being forced to acknowledge the successes of the 5-year plan despite their initial expectations that it would fail. So over here, right, you can very clearly see how I bring in the provenance here of the specific fact that he is an English businessman and how he was disproven in his speech to affirm the claim being made in source B that communism has managed to make the capitalists, and the successors of communism has managed to make the capitalists eat their own words. Thus, source B's claim is indeed reliable given that it is corroborated in both content and context by source C. Okay, so someone asked, how do we know if the source we want to cross-refer to is reliable? Okay, so in this case, right, you are asking whether source C is reliable, right? But I think there's no need, or personally, there is no need for you to go that far to evaluate the reliability of a cross-reference source. The ideal standard for a reliability question is to first look at the question itself and evaluate the provenance of the source to determine whether it is reliable. A weaker indicator would be a cross-reference, which is why provenance is still king if you look at a reliability question. But for the specific facts of this question here, we can see that it is very difficult to use provenance as an indicator of reliability or lack of reliability, right? So you could say that the source is not reliable, but then will you have any meaningful cross-reference to make later on? Because it was very clearly established throughout all the sources that it was indeed true that the first 5-year plan was significantly successful. So a better way to go about doing it, specific to this question, is to cross-refer and then evaluate the provenance of the source to show why it is meaningful, right? So in this case, the source is reliable because it is very unexpected that an English businessman would say that the English businessman would say that communism has been successful. Why? Because traditionally, the West has been very doubtful of communism, and we've expected communism to fail because they ideologically believe that communism is a weaker ideology than capitalism in terms of ensuring economic growth and success. So in this case, while you do not need to address whether the other source is reliable, I would say that yes, source C is reliable, but it is not the most important thing to address here. You must be specific and focus on the question at hand, which is an evaluation of source B's reliability. Another person also asked a general question, when do I write Russians and Soviets? Okay, ideally, you should be using the term Soviets, but in this case, we can see, right, that it is commonly accepted that Russia is pretty much the same as the Soviet Union in this particular context. So in this context, I would say it's okay to use Russia, but personally, I would prefer if you use the term Soviets when referring to the USSR in general. Okay, now we move on to the fourth question. How surprised are you by what this source says? Explain your answer. So this is quite a typical "Are you surprised?" question. So the approach to a "Are you surprised?" question is rather straightforward. You simply have to state the content of the source and whether you are or are not surprised. And when you are stating and when you're explaining why you are or are not surprised, you have to bring in an evaluation of the provenance, a cross-reference, and so on and so forth. So basically, right, a surprise question is not very different from a reliability question, the approach to a reliability question. The only thing that is different is how you phrase it to suit your particular purpose. So let's look at source E. So it is a book published in 1937, written by a communist American journalist who was based in Russia from 1927 to 1934. The source reads, was the first 5-year plan a success? For whom and for what? Certainly not for the individual worker who was terrorized by brutal laws, who had lost control of his own life. Certainly not for the Soviet people who were crushed by cruelties of such a scale. So on and so forth. So the source basically makes out the point that the 5-year plan has been very successful on a wide scale of industrialization. But on a smaller scale, many people actually sacrificed and suffered from communism in the first place. So this is the answer here. Basically, I stated that I am not surprised by what source D says. So source D is a cartoon published by an American which depicts Stalin's Great 5-Year Plan being ruined by the Great Depression. I'm sorry. The question has been phrased wrongly. The question should be study source D, not study source E. Apologize. So basically, are you surprised by this source. So in this case, right, you should focus on the context of the source. The context is that American cartoon, right? So off the bat, you have a very clear provenance, you have a very clear bias towards making the Soviet Union look bad. So I'm therefore not surprised by what source D says, because source D is a cartoon published by an American, which depicts Stalin's Great 5-Year Plan being ruined by the Great Depression. So over here, the explanation is as such, is quite self-evident. So you can see here, what is important is this particular analysis of the provenance. So I am not surprised that the author, an American cartoonist, would convey this message to the audience. Why? Because of the animosity that the American has towards communism, it is not unexpected that he would want to portray communism in a negative light. More specifically, right, so expand a little bit more, I'm not surprised that the American cartoonist would want to portray Stalin's centrally planned economy as a widespread failure in order to exalt the relative successes of capitalism. Why? So you move on to explain the outcome that this source intends to achieve when you're explaining why you're not surprised. So this ties in very closely with the purpose of the source. This would persuade the reader of the failures of communism and result in the reader being more inclined to supporting capitalism over communism. Thus, given the context of the source and the author's anti-communist, pro-capitalist leanings, I am not surprised by what the source says. So in this case, right, the highest level answer will utilize provenance. However, if under exam conditions, you somehow are unable to effectively evaluate the provenance, or you just can't seem to see the light of provenance here, what you should do is state that you are surprised or not surprised, and then cross-refer to another source. So it will not get you as high a mark as you initially would have if you use provenance of the source itself, but it will ensure that you at least have a working answer. So if the question is a 6 or 7 mark question, you will at least be able to score 4 marks out of it. Okay? So someone asked, how come the provenance and info of source B is not enough to prove reliability? I mean, quite obviously, the source is unreliable, right? Because it is information from the Soviet government itself. Why would the government want to contradict their own information and state that their plans have been unsuccessful? So obviously, it would not be that reliable to rely on information published by the Soviet Union, who has a specific agenda in wanting to ensure that people believe that its policies have been successful. Someone asked, for comparison paragraphs, can we explain both sources in one line, or do we have to explain both sources individually? So when you're explaining the sources, you can explain them in one line, but it is a lot cleaner to do it in a separate sentences. Why? Because if you do it in one line, you run the very real risk of not explaining your point enough. So even though a similarity and comparison question doesn't require the same depth of explanation as an inference, you still must have an explanation to fit into the PEEL format. In this case, you have 2 evidences and you have 2 explanations to elaborate on. So as a rule of thumb, I would prefer you split them up into shorter sentences to ensure that you are specifically elaborating on the evidence that you have raised. Someone asked, could I say, so with regard to question 4, could I say that I'm surprised because he's a communist? Okay, so basically, I would just like to point out that there was an error in setting the paper. The question is source D, not source E. Someone asked, for which SPQ type do we need to cross-refer? Sorry, I don't get the question. What SPQ type we need to cross-refer? Okay, specifically the type of questions that you can use cross-reference, not that you need to use cross-reference, is reliability and surprise questions, right? Reliability, usefulness, and surprise questions are the types of questions that you can use cross-reference for. However, as a general rule of thumb, it is better for you to use provenance rather than cross-reference. If you do have time, it is totally fine for you to use provenance, and cross-reference as well, provided you have enough time to write out your answers. Okay, we'll move on to the last question. The first 5-year plan was successful. How far do these sources support this view? Use the sources and your knowledge to explain your answer. Okay, in this case, let me first break down the approach for testing a given hypothesis question. So out of 8 marks, right, 2 marks will come from evaluation. This means 6 marks from your content. A lot of students don't struggle with the content, but they struggle with finding the conclusion. So a lot of students ask, right, do we need to use every single source for testing a given hypothesis question? My answer is no, you do not have to use every single source, but you must have a balanced answer which at least has 4 sources out of 5. So to save time, right, you don't have to write one source, but what I would advocate for is for you to choose your sources carefully so that you have something strong to build up to in your conclusion. So let's look at the answer itself first. One technique you can use to save down on writing is to lump sources that are talking about the same thing, the same specific thing together. So if you look at source A and B, right, they both show that the Stalin's 5-year plan was a success, right? They're not very different in stating otherwise. So you can lump these 2 sources to present a single view, which says that source A and B shows that Stalin's first 5-year plan was a success. You can read the explanation for yourself, which is quite self-explanatory. And then we move on to source C. So source C likewise supports the view that it was a success. So if you look at my writing here, right, instead of just quoting source C, I bring in the context of the source as well. So I will state here in source C, an English businessman states. So this will help you further your analysis later on as you review your answer and you realize that, oh, this is coming from a particular point of view, while this is coming from another particular point of view. So you can read the reasons why the 5-year plan was a success, why it supports the view. It is quite self-explanatory. So later on, when I publish the answers, you can go and take a look at it yourself. Then we look at source D. It again is quite self-explanatory. However, again, I want you to note that in here in my writing, I bring in the context of the source again by highlighting who this source was published from. So here I very clearly write, where American cartoonist claims that the Great Depression had ruined Stalin's carefully planned 5-year plan to his dismay. Right? So I bring in very clearly that it was from an American cartoonist. Then I go on to elaborate, tells me that 5-year plan not a success, given that it was ruined by the abrupt negative consequences of the Great Depression. Lastly, I use source E, which negates that the 5-year plan was entirely a success. So in this case, right, you have to pay attention to the question itself. So the question is, how far do these sources support the view that the 5-year plan was successful? So in this case, right, the question, the given statement in the source seems to imply that the 5-year plan was entirely a success. But source E negates this view by highlighting the areas in which the 5-year plan had failed. Again, note how I bring in the fact that it is a communist American journalist, right? So it's a bit of a strange context, right? It's a bit hard to understand because it is communist, but it's American at the same time. But that's not the most particularly important thing. What I want to focus on for testing a given hypothesis is the conclusion itself. So a lot of students tend to miss out on this conclusion, which is a summary of the reasons why you think that a particular view is more prevalent than another view, right? So if you look here, the conclusion I wrote, overall, the sources do prove that Stalin's 5-year plan was a success, albeit that it had negative implications, right? So how do you back up one claim and refute the other when the sources are all different in portraying a particular view? The way you do this is by creating a more nuanced conclusion. And how you do that? You can either discredit the sources that do not support your view, or explain how they can be balanced to provide for a more nuanced conclusion. So you can see here, right? The conclusion here writes. Sorry, can everyone still hear me? Can you put a thumbs up? Okay, so you can see here, right, that here I wrote, overall, the sources do prove that Stalin's 5-year plan was a success, albeit that it had some negative implications. So I don't completely entirely agree with it, but I do agree with it to a significant extent. So while source D refutes the claim, let's look at source D. It is notable that source D was published by an American cartoonist who has a vested interest in portraying communism in negative light, right? So it is thus unreliable in its claim that the Soviet 5-year plan was categorically a failure. So what did I do here? I refuted the validity of source D to show that in general, it is established that the 5-year plan was a success. Similarly, while source E sheds light on the negative consequences of Stalin's 5-year plan, it is still notable that the author concedes that the foundations were laid for a new industrial empire. So, right, it tells me that on a larger scale, while there were some negative aspects of the 5-year plan, the 5-year plan was still able to achieve widespread economic success in the USSR. As such, the sources prove that in spite of some trade-offs to the average Soviet worker, Stalin's 5-year plan was a tremendous economic success. So if you note in my conclusion, this is the ultimate statement that I'm trying to achieve, that while there were some trade-offs, ultimately it was a success. How did I deal with the sources that refuted this claim? First, I discredited this particular source here. So this particular source here, I discredited it by showing that it was unreliable. And then over here, I managed to use the content of the source itself to come to a more nuanced conclusion to show that I have a good understanding of the question demand, right? So I hope you understand this question. I'm just going to review some of the questions asked in the chat now here. Someone asked, is it compulsory to say what you're surprised about in your answer? Like, I am not surprised by what source D says, since your answer key doesn't have it. Okay, so I didn't put it in the answer key. I think you didn't see it in the answer key, but it's over here, right? I'm not surprised by what source D says. So I hope that answers the question. Or you don't have to write about, because it is very clearly stated in the question demand that how surprised are you by what this source says? You just have to say you're not surprised. Next question is, so for provenances who come from both opposite sides, do they have neutral stance? I don't understand your question. Maybe you can rephrase and send it to me again. Okay, someone asked, does conclusion give additional marks? Yes, conclusion does give additional marks. So if you look at the breakdown of the marks, right, 8 marks over here, 6 marks is for your content. Coming to a good conclusion is the last 2 marks here. So if you simply come to a conclusion itself, you will get some marks, you get 1 mark out of 2. But having a reasoned conclusion will give you the second mark, right? So in event that you're short on time, it is more important to focus on the content itself to get 6 marks. And then just briefly state your conclusion without having to back it up, and it'll get you 7 marks. This is for the perfect answer. For the perfect answer, you will need to be able to reason your conclusion and come to a established conclusion after reasoning why the other sources that refute your general stand is not as reliable, not as strong, or can be reconciled with by your main point or coming to a new nuanced conclusion. Okay, so the same person asked, must reach which level for conclusion? 2 yes, 2 no, 1 yes, 1 no. Okay, so basically, right, in your answer itself, you should have at least 2 sources that support the hypothesis and 2 sources that negate the hypothesis. So I'm not sure what you mean exactly by that, but in the conclusion, you should be reasoning why, if you agree with the given statement, why is it that the sources that disagree with the given statement are not reliable or can be reconciled with the first general statement. For conclusion, need to write about reliability of 2 sources or can just write 1 source. Okay, for your conclusion, right, what I'm specifically talking about is dealing with the sources. So if you see here, right, the sources that stand out from the rest of sources are this, source D and source E, right? Source D specifically goes against the conclusions made in source A to C. And then you have to ask yourself why. How do I reconcile this? How do I hammer down this nail that is sticking out like a sore thumb? How you can do that is by evaluating the reliability of the source. If you can prove that this source is not reliable and that there's a hidden agenda, this will further support your claim that the points made in A to C are accurate or they're more correct in testing the hypothesis. On the other hand, sources like this, where it is not very clear whether you can use a reliability or provenance statement, what you should do is look at the content of the source. Can you reconcile the content with the first 3 sources itself? If you can, then you should reconcile them and come to a more nuanced conclusion on in general or for a more general statement as to how to come to a better conclusion or how you can edit the hypothesis such that it generally agrees that the 5-year plan was a success, but there were some limitations. Okay, I hope this answers your questions. So for history, right, the answers will come later for the structured essay question, but I don't think there's a real need to go through the structured essay question since for the most part, if you refer to your textbooks or you refer to your school worksheets, you'll be able to find the answers for most of them. So what I wanted to focus on is the specific source-based skills. Right, so let's take a quick 5-minute break first, and when we come back, we'll review the social studies paper together. Okay, hi everyone. Just to answer some questions. Someone asked if I'll be going through the hybrid questions. No, at this point of time, I will not be going through the hybrid questions because I didn't set any hybrid questions in the mock paper. If you would like to go through hybrid questions, you can consider attending the crash course, which is next Saturday. So the link will be sent to you later on where to sign up for the crash course if you are keen to do so. And then next question is, do we need to memorize all Sec 3 and 4 questions or topics for history essay questions, or can we just memorize only Sec 3 topics? Okay, I think it's a common misunderstanding among students that you can spot topics well. So I would say that yes, you can spot topics, but I would strongly discourage you from spotting them. And if you were to spot them, I will only spot them in the sense where you ignore a topic that you're not comfortable with. So in the event that it does come out, you are relatively okay because you have other topics that you have studied for. So to answer your question of whether you should spot Sec 3 or Sec 4 topics, I would like to raise the hypothetical situation of where the Sec 3 topic that you studied for is very difficult or very niche, and that will leave you at a significant disadvantage. So to answer your question, I would study all the topics, but if I had to choose on which topics I would not study, first of all, I mean, obviously you can remove your CLT topics, right? The CLT topics are the ones that remove the syllabus and it's not necessary for you to study. Then I would choose one more topic not to study so that at least when I go into the examination, I know that 90% of the questions that come out, I can answer them. Okay, so now we'll move on to the social studies paper. Again, I'll be mainly going through the source base, because the source base skills are more important than the structured essay questions, which all of it you can go through yourself and understand it, right? So if you want more details on answering techniques for structured essay questions or a specific guidebook, you can consider purchasing the curated notes. Again, that one, the link will be sent to you on where to order the curated notes from, okay? So let's look at the first question, study source B. Why did the minister make this speech? Again, it's a very simple inference to purpose kind of question. So if you look at it, right, we first have to understand the content of the source. So it's saying that quick and accurate contact tracing is necessary, and all the more essential now that we are emerging from a circuit breaker. So right off the bat, you can tell that it is clearly dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic and the impacts of data security in terms of contact tracing. Trace Together as a digital tool has provided data that speeds up the isolation of close contacts and reduce the spread of COVID-19. Our contact tracing app and device do not track location. It acts as a personal electronic diary. All of us would want to know if you have been exposed to someone who was infective, so that we can take the necessary precautions. The more of us who are on the system, the better it is for everyone. We have to get the balance right between public health and personal privacy. It is possible to protect both. So you can see from the content of the source, it was clearly meant to address people's concerns about personal privacy with regard to the use of technology to contact trace in a time of the pandemic. The context of this information is that it's coming from Dr. Balakrishnan, the minister in charge of the Smart Nation initiative. So it is from the government. So the government, you have to see what is the purpose of the source, what is the intended action, and what is the outcome that the government like to achieve by publishing this source. So you see here, Dr. Balakrishnan made this speech to assure Singaporeans of the necessity of the government's use of Trace Together in order to secure greater compliance from Singaporeans. So the purpose is to assure in order to achieve the outcome of securing greater compliance from Singaporeans, right? So you raise the evidence, then you move on to elaborate. Clearly, Dr. Balakrishnan is informing Singaporeans of the importance of using the Trace Together application by appealing to the need for communal safeguards against COVID-19. From his speech, it is evident that Dr. Balakrishnan wants to persuade Singaporeans to adopt the system, right? That's the action he wants to achieve in order to enhance the communal effectiveness of contact tracing outcome. So for this kind of questions, you have to ask yourself, what is the purpose, the action, and the outcome, and write accordingly. Okay, so this is rather straightforward. I won't spend too much time dwelling on it. Second question, how are these sources different? Explain your answer. So you can see from the way this question is phrased, it requires a similar and different approach. You have to state the similarity and then state the difference. So let's look at source C and D. Both of them are talking about the impact of digitalization on people's jobs in Singapore, right? So both of them are rather similar in specifically highlighting how the trend of digitalization has the negative consequence of potentially leaving many Singaporeans behind. So you can see here, right, that in my answer, I split the information between source C and source D separately. So I raise the evidence for source C, then I go on to elaborate on evidence in source C. After that, I state the evidence in source D, and I go on to elaborate the evidence in source D. Afterwards, I combine them together and state that this clearly highlights the potential fallout of not embracing digitalization, such that it might lead to massive job losses and unemployment in Singapore. So now I'm stating the similarities after I'm done elaborating on it. Moving on to the differences, what is important here is that the sources differ in highlighting the extent to which Singaporean government is effective in helping Singaporeans cope with this new wave of digitalization. So I think this is quite self-evident here. Many of the points that I've raised about the history source-based skills and social studies source-based skills overlap. So where many students suffer is in their inability to correctly identify the information needed. So all I can say for this, right, is to be more astute when you're looking at the source itself and identify clearly and specifically what is it that the sources are different in. Okay? Moving on to the third question. Are you surprised by what source D says about the impact of technological advancements on Singaporean workers? Explain your answer. So this is a are you surprised question. Again, it is very similar to the history source-based skills one. You need to state that you're surprised and what you're surprised about, and explain why is it that you're not surprised. So in this case, you could either use a provenance of the source evaluation or a cross-reference. So let's look at the answer here. I'm not surprised by what source D writes about the impact of technological advancements on workers in Singapore. Source D makes the point that many Singaporeans will be adversely affected by the trend of digitalization, specifically production workers and laborers in Singapore. Then you go on to explain why you're not surprised or why it's not surprising. This is not surprising because this information is corroborated by source C, which is an excerpt from the MPI, Mr. Chan Chun Sing. Then you go on to explain how the elaboration here or the inference here is corroborated with that of source D. So the reason why I jump straight into the cross-reference here is because when you look at the source itself, right? Is there really anything that you can meaningfully glean from an evaluation of the provenance? There's not really much that you can say, right? So using a cross-reference is a more effective way to ensure that you're able to answer the question effectively. So after you have established how the cross-reference shows that the information in source D is not surprising, I go on to elaborate. Given that source C highlights that technology will become increasingly prevalent in our daily lives, it is unsurprising that source D would emphasize the negative consequences of digitalization, particularly on blue-collar workers, who would likely face the brunt of redundancies in the light of digitalization and the embracing of technology. Okay, this is a question that I want to spend a little bit more time on, which is the usefulness question. So far we have covered reliability, surprise. Now we have a new novel question of usefulness. So again, right, as I mentioned just now, there are a significant overlaps between surprise, reliability, and usefulness questions. So how do you determine whether a source is useful is by looking at the content, the context, and then cross-referring the source. Why content? Content can explain to you, or the content of the source is useful in explaining to you specifically how technology has benefited people, right? The context of the source will explain to you whether the information in the source is useful in terms of its reliability or in terms of its unique position in being able to give you more information about the topic at hand. A source is useful as if it is cross-referenced because it also indicates that it's reliable. However, I want you to focus on the first two aspects, which is content and context of the source itself, because these are more important factors in establishing usefulness of a particular source. So let's look at source E itself. So right off the bat, right, you can see that this is information coming from one of the lead authors of the study and director of economic consulting for Asia at Oxford Economics. So if you're looking at usefulness, you already know that it is going to be useful because he's from a policy expert. He is someone who has spent a lot of time researching the impact of digitalization and technology, right? So source E is useful in highlighting the benefits of digital technology, especially in the context of Singapore. Source E states, Singapore has an aging population, so on and so forth. This tells us, now I'm looking at the content of the source, that in the context of Singapore, embracing technology will be a particularly good thing, as it can help us ensure economic growth despite the perennial problems of an aging population and shrinking annual workforce. Furthermore, source E is useful, so now I'm bringing in the context of the source because it is an expert opinion coming from James Lambert, who is the Director of Economic Consulting for Asia at Oxford Economics. So his occupational expertise enhances the usefulness in source E, since it is more likely to be credible and deliberate in thought. So you can see here, I bring in content and then context of the source. This will help you secure more marks. So at this point, does anyone have any questions on how to address a usefulness question? Because it seems like most of you are okay for social studies because there isn't as many questions as before. If not, I'll just move on to the... Sorry, someone asked, must show reliability. No, it is not completely necessary to show reliability, but reliability is a factor that you can depend on to explain the usefulness of the source. So in this case, right, if you could show that the context of the source would very clearly show a clear bias towards another stance, then you could evaluate the usefulness of the source by stating that the source is reliable or not reliable, right? But over here, the crux of the context is not that it is not reliable, but more of the fact that it is useful because it comes from an expert himself. Someone else asked, don't need to cross-reference to another source. Okay, so cross-reference, right, is something that will get you your L2, L3. But if you're able to bring in the provenance of the source, it means that you are able to secure most of the marks already, because evaluating the provenance of the source will ensure that your answer is basically in the highest band that you can achieve. So in this case, if you can talk about provenance, talk about the context of the source, there is not much need to bring in a cross-reference. So someone asked if we can use provenance for any source. Basically, you have to look at what the question is asking you. If the question is asking about source E, then you should be evaluating the provenance of source E. Okay? Okay, let's focus on the last question. How far do the sources show that technological advancements have benefited Singapore? Explain your answer. So in the context of this paper, right, you see that all of them are talking about different facets of technological advancements. So first you have to talk about whether technology has benefited or harmed people, and then you have to talk about in what ways has technology benefited or harmed people after you have established that. So if we look at the sources itself, source A is quite self-explanatory. It shows that technology has not been beneficial because it has a negative impact on people's ability to focus. On sources that show that technology is not beneficial, source D also shows that it has not been beneficial because it has the negative consequences of resulting in major job losses and disruptions. On the other hand, source B highlights the positive impact of technology, especially in the light of the pandemic. So it's focused on the health benefits or the communal benefits that can be achieved from the source itself. From technology itself. So here, technology has been positive because it has allowed Singapore to operate more effectively in managing large-scale health crises like the COVID-19 pandemic. And then lastly, you have source E, which highlights the positive economic impacts of technology, specifically in the context of Singapore. What I want to focus on here is the conclusion over here, which states that, I'll just read through the conclusion first. Overall, I would argue that while technology has its negative consequences, the positive impacts of embracing technology far outweigh the negative. While individuals are indeed more distracted by technology, this can be countered by using other technological developments such as focused applications that can limit one's usage of social media application. On the issue of economic displacement, the widespread positive impacts of embracing technology outlined in source E far outweighs the negative, especially given the fact that actions can be taken to mitigate the consequences. Thus, the sources conclude that technology has had an overall positive impact on society. So when you're looking at the conclusion, right, there are many ways to go about doing a conclusion. So in the case of the history paper just now, the reason why I use the approach where I discredited the sources that are not useful for me is because there is a very clear establishment of motive in the other sources. However, in this case, right, a lot of it is a matter of perspective or facets of the issue, which is why you have to deal with the issues itself. Although you cannot deny that there has been negative impacts of technology, is there a way for us to mitigate it such that overall technology has been more beneficial? If yes, you can still argue that overall, the sources do show that technology has been more beneficial than negative. So in this case, right, it's a very different approach to dealing with conclusion based on the source content itself. So if you see the source content, right, you'll notice that a lot of it doesn't really have a very specific agenda, or the source context doesn't have a specific agenda to show false or misrepresented information. In this case, what you should do is to deal and reconcile with the information to show how it would, at the end of the day, reach the balanced conclusion that you want to achieve, right? So this is really strongly dependent on the sources that you will face on the day of the examination itself. Okay, so it's not so straightforward in writing a conclusion, but what I can offer you is this. If you are not confident in writing a conclusion, spend more time developing the content of your answer. If you can get the inference right for a 10-mark question, the inference of all the sources right for a 10-mark question, you are able to secure 7 marks already. Simply stating that overall, I believe that technology has been more beneficial than negative, or has had more positive than negative consequences, will get you the 1 mark. So if you look at it, if you get all your inference right, and you just come to a statement of conclusion, you get 8 marks already. The last 2 marks will be derived from you reasoning your conclusion. Okay? So actually, I've come to the end of going through the source-based skills. Again, I won't be going through the structured essay questions because the answers are quite self-explanatory. You can find them in the answer sheet later. What I'll be doing is to deal with the questions that have been raised here. Someone asked, I thought provenance is the statement above the source. Yes. Provenance is the statement of the source. It is also the context surrounding the source itself. Why is it being published? Who is it being published by? What is the intended outcome of the source? That is the provenance of the source. It is something that takes into account all the background factors around the source. Someone asked, you use the provenance to okay. Isn't it better to write the cross-reference first than the provenance? The chances of you getting the provenance right is low, so it will be safer, right? Okay, so you are not wrong in stating that it will be better to write a cross-reference first, but this is more for students who can perform at a higher level, who are able to very clearly see the provenance of the source. If you can clearly see the provenance of the source, right, there is no need for you to waste your time and write a cross-reference because you can get the full marks with a shorter answer. But if you are not very certain of yourself, then yes, you can write the cross-reference first. But just be careful that it will be more time-consuming. Okay, so someone said, GG for conclusion, I always write thus I feel. Okay, when you're writing an essay, right, ideally I would say do not use the term I feel. Because I feel is not a very strong objective stance. What you're trying to convey to the examiner is that you have a strong objective stance, that you have reason from multiple reasons to determine why you have come to that stance. The reasons could be the lack of reliability of sources that counter your claim, or how your claim is more nuanced than the hypothesis because you have managed to reconcile the differences in content in the sources. Okay, someone mentioned, my teacher said that for question 1E, we have to infer all the sources. Do we really have to? Okay. While it is good for you to infer all the sources to show that you're using all the sources, I acknowledge that it is very unrealistic for you to use all the sources. Why? Because most students, most students, they have the issue of time management, right? If you're facing the issue of time management, why would you even, if you're facing the issue of time management, then you wouldn't have time to finish all the sources, right? It is better for you to just do 4 sources well and come to a strong conclusion, which will secure you more marks than giving a half completed answer. For SRQ Part A, how do we come up with relevant reasons, ideas on the spot? Okay, for that question, I have nothing more to say then. Sorry, but you have to study hard. So you have to study the content itself, and you have to look at model essays and see how the answers come out. Someone asked, do you memorize all the dates for history, or what are the key dates that you remember, or how do you even memorize so much, especially for history? Okay, so in the case of history, right, my advice to you is you just have to study lah. You really just have to study. How to memorize things more effectively is to write them out yourself, right? So reading, it has been proven, right, that just by reading, you won't be able to digest the content, or you won't be able to memorize all the content. It's better for you to write out and then highlight the salient dates. So not all the dates are important. And then for a contingency plan, right, if in the exam itself, you really cannot memorize the dates, then just say in the general, like let's state very generally, in 1946, this happened. You don't have to say the specific date of 12 February 1946. You could just say 1946, this thing happened, right? What is important for your answer is less so of your ability to memorize the specific dates, but more so of your understanding of how the dates interact with each other, or how the events interact with each other, and give a good explanation in your answer. So for the 4 sources you choose, yes, it has to be 2 agree, 2 disagree minimum. You have to give a balanced answer. If you don't give a balanced answer, in that if you put all your sources disagree or agree, you'll be marked down very heavily. Do we need to take a stand in Part E SBQ questions? Yes, you will need to take a stand. So your conclusion is 3 marks for your Part E question, right? Simply taking a stand or making a stand is 1 out of 3 marks. So the first 1 mark is free. The last 2 marks depends on how strong your reason conclusion is. Okay, to score full marks for E, you will need to write 2 disagree, 2 agree paragraphs, and then come to a balanced conclusion in order to, you need a balanced and reasoned conclusion in order to get the full marks. So a reasoned conclusion would be you stating a stand and then backing up the reason for your stand. And how you can back it up is by, evaluating the provenance of the sources that go against your claim and stating that it is unreliable, or you can reconcile the information between the disagree sources and state that, well, it is valid overall based on my contextual knowledge or based on my application of the facts to the matter at hand. At the end of the day, my stance is more valid. How to manage your time in social studies history papers. Okay, so some tips that are in the curated notes already is to divide the questions by the mark allocation. So if you look at the mark allocation, right, what you should be spending, for 1 mark, you should be spending a maximum of 2 minutes on. So in this case, if you see it's a 6-mark question, don't spend more than 12 minutes, right? If you cannot hit that time limit, move on and come back to it later. Because if you are exceeding the time limit, you're actually operating on borrowed time, which means that the rest of your answers will all suffer. If you cannot finish within the allocated time, chances are that this question is particularly hard, or you might not understand the demand of this question, which might result in you not doing so well in the question in the first place. If at the end of the day you're not doing so well for that question, might as well move on and secure the marks that you can secure in the other questions. Okay, for part B, if I cannot find similarity, does saying 2 differences give me the mark? No, it will not give you the mark because the question demand is clearly 1 similarity and 1 difference. If you only write on differences or only write on similarities, then you will suffer because at the end of the day, I can only award you a maximum of half the amount of marks. Okay, so actually at this point of time, I've managed to go through, I think, what is necessary. I don't think there are any more questions at this point of time. So I'll just finish off over here. If you thought that if you feel like today's lesson was helpful and would like to go through more questions and understand more about how to understand the question types, you can opt to sign up for Overmark's crash courses. So it's about $140 for a 4-hour session, and we'll go through all the key content pointers for each chapter and the necessary skills needed for each type of for each subject. So over here, you can just refer to our website link at overmark.com to sign up for the courses. If you would not like to attend if you don't want to attend a course, you could opt for to purchase the curated notes. So they will be sent to you after confirmation of purchase in about 2 to 3 working days, which includes sample essays and a breakdown of the exam skills and tips and the content summaries for each subject. So curated notes, the prices are over here. These are the notes that we have. So we have pretty much for every subject: chemistry, physics, bio, combined science, EA, math, English, and combined humanities. Okay. So at this point in time, I hope that everyone has found this lesson useful. Thank you very much. I hope all of you are able to study hard and achieve your potential, all right? Okay, thank you everyone. Bye-bye.